So here we go. So the final video of the semester. We get to close it all up. We have something a little bit different this week because for the most part throughout we've been looking at theories of mind or specific issues with various theories of mind. We've been doing philosophy of mind, but now we have, and I've been urging throughout that the philosophy of mind we're concerned with is aimed at giving a scientific account of the mind. We've been doing a science of the mind throughout, but we've not been doing a philosophy of the science of the mind. We've been doing the philosophy of the mind, now we're concerned with the philosophy of the science of the mind. And so this talk of naturalism this week with Mcginn and Flanagan is concerned with a higher level view of the philosophy of mind. What are the prospects for truly developing a scientific account of the mind? Throughout, we've been trying to develop an account of mind. Now we're looking at a higher level look at the prospects of doing such. And so naturalism, last week I said something that's true about naturalism, but maybe somewhat misleading. I said that there was a move from materialism to physicalism, once we come to believe there were non-massive physical things, and then from physicalism to naturalism. And that is true in sort of the etiology of the terms, the way the words are used, but there's a real debate within naturalism as to whether or not naturalism should be taken as primarily a methodological or epistemological position or primarily an ontological position. And to the extent that naturalism has replaced physicalism, which replaced materialism, what we're talking there are various conceptions of a monist ontology. So naturalism used in that way is an ontological position. But I am of the opinion that it can be established that for consistency's sake, naturalism has to be taken as primarily methodological or epistemological in nature. The ontological commitments of naturalism follow from the methodological, epistemological commitments of naturalism. Nonetheless, naturalism does say among its ontology that all there are natural things. Now, we can't just say that naturalism says there are natural things and natural things are those things that naturalism says exist, because then we have a very tight circle. But we can say more than that. Specifically, what we're saying is the ontology that is allowed by naturalism is a result of the methodology and the epistemology established as naturalistic. But this distinction between the methodology and the ontology of epistemology, of naturalism, and specifically that the methodology and the epistemology comes first. We don't start with ontological commitments and from that develop epistemological and methodological commitments in naturalism. We start with a methodology and epistemology, and then from that we establish an ontology for naturalism. So then Cullen Mcginn, he starts out by saying, well, look, it's time that we admit that we cannot solve the mind-body problem. It's been, hundreds of years since Descartes, and we've made no progress in understanding and explaining how the mind and body interact, he said. So first, here's a claim. Look at the evidence, look at the history of attempts to try and explain mind-body interaction. And since Descartes forward, even before Descartes, if we want to be anachronistic and say that there was mind then, we have theory upon theory upon theory trying to explain the relationship between mind and body. And what we have is a series of failures to explain the relationship between mind and body, both metaphysically and scientifically. And so it's time for us to admit that we've made no progress, and therefore, from that fact, we need to admit that we cannot solve the mind-body problem. This is called a pessimistic meta-induction, right? Non-realists use this sort of reasoning sometimes to say, look, we have reason to believe that science does not deliver us reality. Why? Because look at the history of science. Many times we've said, we have reality, we have a real account of the world, and then later we change our scientific account of the world. So we thought we were right and we were wrong, and then once we corrected that wrong, we thought we were right and then we were wrong. And the history of science shows us that what we are progressively claiming, I'm right and yet I'm wrong. And so we have very good reason right now, despite the fact that we have evidence to think we're right, that we are actually wrong. That's a pessimistic meta-induction, an induction on inductions. And we have something like that here in Mcginn. Look at the history. Lots of people came in and said, look, I have a new theory of mind, can explain mind-body interaction, but then a problem comes in and shows, well, actually you cannot. There's a problem with this theory too. Because of that nature of this progressive failure, we need to admit we cannot solve the mind-body problem. Now this is an induction, there's a jump there. We go from evidence that, well, we've been wrong often, therefore maybe we think we are wrong now. That's one jump. And then the second jump is to say, and we can never get it right. There's a gap there. But he's not trying to prove anything deductively. It's inductive. So, okay, he thinks the evidence is in favor of believing we'll never find a solution to the mind-body problem. He says, very strong things. He says, you know, we have no idea. Science gives us no idea about how the mind and the body interact. Nonetheless, we know that the mind supervenes on the body, on the brain. Now, there's a tension there. Well, as usual, I'll sort of criticize as I go. But if we're going to say that science does not have us tell us anything about how the mind and body interact, but we know that the mind supervenes on the body or on the brain, particularly on the brain, that the brain is the thing that helps us produce, have a mind. Well, that's a bit of knowledge. It's a bit of knowledge we have, and at some point in our history we did not have. So it seems false that we're not getting any idea from science about how mind and body interact. We do have some idea. The mind is intimately connected to the brain as opposed to my big toe on my left foot. So maybe the claim is just we're not making enough progress. We're not making progress fast enough. But I think even if you were to talk more carefully and say we're making some progress but not that much, he can still maintain his important claims. So he says if we look at the history of theories of mind, we have two main kinds of theories. We have those theories that are constructive, say there is some way to explain mind-body interaction. There is some scientific way to explain mind-body interaction, a way to account for it naturally. One kind of theory, constructive. The other kind of theory, non-natural. It says that mind-body, an explanation of mind-body interaction, has to turn on something not explained by natural science, something supernatural. And therefore not constructive because we can't explain that given our scientific resources. So you have a choice historically between a constructive approach that says science can give us a natural account of mind-body interaction and a non-natural approach which says science cannot. It takes something supernatural and therefore not constructive. We can't operate with this account. He wants to deny both these, combine, and he wants to give a non-constructive but natural account of mind-body interaction. And so, well, if I were to put up on the chart, and a chart on the board where we have a choice between constructive, non-constructive, non-natural, natural, all of the theories we've been looking at are natural, constructive theories, except for Descartes, possibly, Chalmers. Chalmers seemed to be non-natural. Chalmers seemed to be non-constructive. We have not yet. Descartes was non-natural, constructive. He wanted to be constructive. Well, because we can't bridge the mind-body gap, he was not constructive. Nonetheless, the only person we've seen that would claim to be a constructivist and a naturalist is Mcginn. And it's a curious sort of position because the non-constructive position is an epistemic claim that we cannot give an account of mind-body interaction. We're not able to. We cannot know what mind-body interaction is. He talks about property P. Property P is the property by which the mind and body interact. We cannot know by our nature property P. If we cannot know property P, we cannot know how mind and body interact. Therefore, the non-constructivism aspect of his theory. Despite this, he's a naturalist, ontologically. So the non-constructivist claim is an epistemic claim, a negative epistemic claim. The naturalist claim is a positive ontological claim, and that claim is that even though we can never explain property P, never explain mind-body interaction, we can, at least he can, be confident that there is a natural explanation of P, mind-body interaction. So I don't want to litter my board here, but we have non-constructive naturalism. And this is a negative epistemic position. This is a positive ontological position. And the goal is to explain property P, and property P explains mind-body interaction. Right? How do mind and body interact? They interact by way of some property. Let's name that property P. In order to have an account of mind and mind-body interaction, we would have to have an account of P. We cannot, by our nature, it's an epistemic claim, know property P. So, non-constructive. Nonetheless, ontologically, there is such a natural property P and a natural theory that contains property P. And so, mind-body interaction is not spooky. It does not require us to be dualist. It is a natural and therefore monist, accounted by whatever our ontology is. We don't need to say physics because we're no longer physicalists. We are naturalists, and therefore our ontology is whatever is natural. If that includes physics, biology, economics, whatever we want to put in here, it is natural and therefore not dualistic. And so how do we explain that there could be a theory that contains property P and therefore makes property P and mind-body interaction natural without us having the ability to know it? One issue is that there can be theories that are beyond our ability to know. And he says, look, this is like a child. A child can see a problem without seeing the solution to the problem. We can see the mind-body problem and not be able to see the solution to the mind-body problem. But for the child, as a matter of fact, not only does the child not see the solution to the mind-body problem, the child, at that point, cannot see the solution to the problem. And that's how we stand in relation to the mind-body problem, where he talks about a monkey and arithmetic. The problem of arithmetic is not conceptually closed to us. We can have the concepts needed to do arithmetic, and we can operate on those concepts. A monkey cannot. So arithmetic is conceptually closed to a monkey. Okay? Or you can think of an eye seeing itself. An eye cannot, without the aid of something external, see itself. You cannot look at your own eye. The eye, the appearance of the eye is conceptually closed to the eye. And this is the stance we are in relation to the mind-body problem. The solution to the mind-body problem. Property P is causally, conceptually closed to us. We cannot have a handle on it by our very nature. And he'll go on to explain more about this in a second. And so, first, there must exist a natural account of the mind. That's okay. There can be a natural account of the mind without us being able to have it because where it can be able to see a problem without seeing the solution to it. He says that to think that we would be able to understand any natural theory is arrogant. That would be to assume that we have total cognitive, conceptual openness. Cognitive openness, but as a matter of fact, some things are cognitively closed to us. Debates over, say, the nature of infinity, whether we can ever actually understand the infinite, given that we have a finite mind. Maybe we can abstract from ideas we have and think we understand what it would be like to keep adding and adding and adding, or dividing and dividing and dividing, and extend that out. But we could never have a concept of the infinite because we have a finite mind. So this sort of debate occurs. In this case, the infinite would be cognitively closed to us by the nature of our mind. And he says that there would be no grounds for assuming that we could understand any and every theory that is natural except for arrogance. It would be a metaphysical position, not based on the evidence, that we can understand the entire world. We've seen this sort of claim before. We saw this with Chalmers and Foster, and at the time I said, no, this is not true. And I'm still saying, no, this is not true. Mcginn is wrong here to claim that the only grounds we would have for holding that we can understand any given theory is arrogance or a metaphysical position that's unjustified, or unwarranted. No, he's wrong. There are other positions. I'll give you a position for holding this later. So this sort of explains how it is that we're non-constructivists, how there could be a theory that's closed to us, but how the confidence that there is a natural theory. One is to explain the non-constructivist part. How could it be the case that we could not come up with a solution given that there's a natural account to be had? Well, because we're cognitively closed with regards to P. But then run it the other way. How is it that we can be sure that there's a natural account to be had given that it's cognitively closed to us? And this, I think, is a real burden for Mcginn to carry. And the way he does it is he says, well, look, we can explain that maybe we're motivated to think that the mind-body problem, property P, is something mysterious and therefore not natural. But the motivation for that comes from the fact that the mind-body problem looks really strange, mysterious to us. It looks really strange, mysterious to us because its solution is cognitively closed to us. It's a boggler. It's always going to be a boggler because we're conceptually closed to the solution. The solution is off limits to us. And then to motivate this more, he says, well, look, there is no way to capture property P, understand mind-body interaction by way of the resources we have available to us. So we could use our phenomenological resources, our psychology, our own experiences. We can sit down and think about our own experiences as long as we want in sort of Cartesian style and phenomenologist style. However, this is not going to deliver us property P because property P has to do with the interaction between the mind and the body. But all the input, once we sit down and pay lots of attention to our personal subjective experience, is going to be phenomenological. It's going to be mental. We cannot sit down and understand what it is like to experience our brain directly. We have the experiences. These are mental properties. We cannot from that turn our mental properties inside our head and see what's going on with the brain at that time. So we can't use phenomenology. We can't use our subjective experience to access the mind-body problem. It's closed, conceptually closed. The solution to the mind-body problem, property P, is conceptually closed from the standpoint of phenomenology, from the standpoint of subjective experience. Then what else can we do? Well, we could look at the physical side. We can look at the neurology. We could have a neurologist study our brain. We could study our brain. We could put ourselves in MRIs and CAT scans and so on. We can cut open skulls and watch what happens in the brain. But the problem is there, two things. We cannot observe by looking at something physical, the non-physical, the mental. So we can see what's going on in the brain, but we can't see what's going on in the mind. And we cannot get to the mental by way of an inference to the best explanation, because all we have to deal with are physical inputs, physical evidence, and causal physical relationships. We cannot get from those to some theory about how something non-physical interacts with something physical. When we say non-physical here, we don't mean something ontologically different than the natural. What we mean is something that's not the brain, not the body. The mind is not. It's at least a process of, a function of, etc. We cannot give an account of how the mind and body interact. From the phenomenological standpoint, property P is closed from that standpoint. Property P is closed from the standpoint of neurology. And it seems sort of glaringly oversightful at this point to think that we could access property P from phenomenology or neuroscience. I mean, I'm giving away the game here a little bit, but I already have last week. But phenomenology is the study of experience, which is mental, and neurology is the experience of the physical parts. Right? The brain, the cells of the brain, the physical part, the body part. But the property P is the property that allows mind-body interaction, the interaction between the mental and the body, the interaction between the phenomenology and the neuroscience. So why think that we could realize the interaction between the two by looking at either of them in isolation? This seems to be an issue. He does talk a little bit about looking at the interaction between the two, but I don't really understand what he says at that point. But this is to explain how we can be sure, given that we're causally closed, that there is nonetheless a natural solution. We might be motivated to think that there is something non-natural about property P, but that is because we find ourselves in this situation. It's like a gestalt. If I put up a Necker cube, I'm a little afraid to even try this at this point, but if I put up a Necker cube, I wonder whether this will work. See if my Necker cube works. My Necker cube works, right? I can see this surface as the front surface, or I can see this surface as the front surface. I cannot, however, see both of them as the front surface at the same time. I can oscillate between one or the other. And this is the situation we find ourselves in. We can oscillate between phenomenology or neuroscience. From neither standpoint can we make sense of property P. And so it seems queer, it seems non-natural, mysterious to us. That explains how there is a natural theory, because it only appears like there isn't a natural theory because of our causal closedness. I'm not sure that I buy this. It does seem to explain why property P would seem mysterious to us when it's not. It does not, for me, seem to explain why we should be confident that theory T that explains property P is a natural theory. I'm not entirely convinced there. But so he has a pessimistic conclusion. One, we're non-constructivists. We can never have a theory that contains property P. We can never have a theory of mind-body interaction because we are conceptually closed. That theory is conceptually closed to us. Nonetheless, there's something optimistic here. And that is that the mind-body problem is only apparent. It only seems like there's a mind-body problem. It seems like there's a mind-body problem because of our causal closure. And so, well, First, he says that there's no way to understand consciousness from the organization of matter. He says this at some point. But one thing that I'm concerned with here is that the way Mcginn talks, he talks as if there is a monolithic thing, consciousness. And to get property P, we have to explain consciousness being part of the mind, not all of the mind, part of the mind. Part of the problem is we cannot explain consciousness by way of organization of matter. Now first, why assume that we have to be dealing with matter? That's an issue. But nonetheless, it seems, this way of talking and the way he talks throughout, it seems like there is something monolithic that is consciousness, that we have to figure out what is the body thing that is connected to that thing C consciousness, and property P that explains the connection of that thing consciousness to the thing in the body. But I think this is not the way to go about it. I don't think there's any reason to assume that consciousness is a monolithic thing. Right? So the idea that we have to oscillate between this Necker cube position, either phenomenology or neuroscience, phenomenology or neuroscience, and we can never, from those standpoints, the standpoint of phenomenology or the standpoint from neuroscience, capture consciousness, C, this monolithic thing. But if C is not monolithic, maybe there are parts of it we can access phenomenologically and parts of it we can access neurologically. And even though we're not from that going to deliver a full count of consciousness right away, nonetheless we can build up pieces and pieces and pieces of a theory of consciousness until we have a theory of consciousness, and then pieces and pieces and pieces until we have a theory of mind. But the stance we're left at the end of Mcginn is we're left within naturalism. If we're not going to take some sort of a non-natural dualist ontological position, or if we're not going to allow a priori metaphysical methods, if we're going to limit our epistemological methodology to the methods of science, then we're within naturalism. And within naturalism, Mcginn says, well, look here. I say, according to naturalism, there is no theory of mind, but there's also no mind-body problem. So the fact that we do not have a theory of mind may be not that concerning, because part of our motivation for getting a theory of mind, part of our motivation, was to explain how mind and body interact. There's no real problem there with how mind and body interact. It's entirely natural, not spooky, probably very simple. Property P is probably very simple. Right? But we just can't capture property P because of our epistemic nature. It's closed to us. It's a blind spot. And so Mcginn says, well, there can be no theory of mind, pessimistic. Optimistic, there is no mind-body problem. And so there you go. And then we're going to see with Flanagan, to go ahead a little bit, Flanagan also dealing within naturalism. So here we have a debate between naturalists, and he's going to say that, well, there is a mind-body problem, but we can have a theory of mind. And so we have a choice here. Mcginn says, no theory of mind, but no mind-body problem. Flanagan says, mind-body problem, but possibly a theory of mind. And so it seems like maybe we have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. If we want to get rid of the problem of mind, we have to get rid of the prospect of having a theory of mind. If we want to have a theory of mind, one thing we have to do, because part of the goal of having a theory of mind is to explain the mind-body problem, we have to get around that problem or get through that problem, solve that problem. So if we want a theory of mind, we do have to face down the problem of mind-body interaction. And so this is the stance Flanagan's going to take within naturalism. And he's going to say up front, contrary to Mcginn, it's not unlikely, there's not a bad prospect that we have a theory of mind, and it's not even a bad prospect that we have a unified theory of mind. So a unified theory of mind would be not a group of various explanations, but they all fit together nicely into one theory, each part supporting the other. And so not only are the prospects of a theory of mind not bad, or a theory of consciousness specifically not bad, And look, you need to understand that consciousness is a part of mind. And therefore, to have a theory of mind, we have to have a theory of consciousness. The prospect of having a theory of consciousness, which is taken to be one of the hardest parts of developing a theory of mind, not bad prospects. Not bad prospects to have a unified theory of consciousness, which is even a more powerful, better sort of thing to have. And so Flanagan starts out and he says, well, look, let's start with 3 assumptions. 1, consciousness exists. It seems like everyone agrees with that. Consciousness exists. 2, consciousness has deep and hidden structure. This is important because this is the denial that consciousness is monolithic. Consciousness has lots of different parts. Some of them are hidden to us. That is, not that they're closed to us, but rather that they have been overlooked. Consciousness has deep, hidden, overlooked parts. Has parts, is not monolithic. So we're not going to be put in this Necker cube position, at least potentially, with regards to consciousness in general. Not everything about consciousness is subjective. We've seen this before. There are functional parts of consciousness, right? Chalmers seemed to be pushing that all of consciousness was subjective or qualitative. There are certainly qualitative aspects to subjective awareness, to consciousness, but there are also functional properties, right? They act as input for my propositional attitudes based independent of their qualitative properties. So point 1, consciousness exists. Point 2, consciousness is not monolithic. It has hidden, that is, overlooked, not blind to us parts. 3, consciousness, the mental states, the properties, the events associated with consciousness are heterogeneous. Not only are there parts from point 2, point 3, these parts are heterogeneous. They're of different sorts. And this is important because, you know, the qualitative experiences of consciousness, they have qualitative aspects. The propositional parts do not need, it seems, to have qualitative aspects. Even those who would say zombies are possible still have a role for propositional attitudes, but it seems that we're conscious about propositional attitudes. And so we have very different kinds of things, or even if we just hold ourselves to qualia, we have very different kinds of things. The qualitative experience of seeing red, very different than the qualitative experience of tasting coffee, very different than the qualitative experience of feeling jealousy. Right? And so very different sorts of things here. So there's an objection. Okay, Flanagan, you've admitted 3 things. Consciousness exists, consciousness has deep, hidden structure, and the parts among consciousness are different, heterogeneous. There's an objection. If they're heterogeneous, then there can be no unity among them, and there cannot be any theory that captures them. Right? So we want a theory of some phenomena. We need a certain coherence among those phenomena in order to give an account of those phenomena. But if they're heterogeneous, so goes the objection, there can be no theory about them. And his response is, well, no, this is just false. What science does is unify phenomena. Unifies phenomena based on some properties they share in common as a group, not a single property that all of them have in common necessarily, but a group of properties that they as a group share with some degree of overlap, some degree of non-identity, and so forth. But if you look at the periodic table, if you look at our account of chemistry, our account of physics, what we do is we bring together things that are recognized within chemistry, within physics, to be very different sorts of things. Nonetheless, we can develop a way of talking so that there's a coherence among them. All of these different things have similarities, and theories unify heterogeneous things, things with differences. And so it's just not true that if there's heterogeny there, that we can't have a theory or we can't unify. We can unify. We have to find some way to cohere this various group of different things. Okay, but maybe the issue is not that they are different, but that they're vastly different. Not only are they heterogeneous, but they're a hodgepodge. Right? I mean, if I were to give you a group of things, could there be a science of love, the Eiffel Tower, dogs, and oxygen? I've given you four vastly different things there. And it doesn't seem that there's going to be a good way to give coherence to them. I could give coherence. Those four things are all among the list of the four things I just talked about. Okay, but that's not going to underwrite prediction, control, and explanation. I need there to be some similarity to develop a theory that's useful for our scientific purposes of prediction, control, and explanation. And if the things in the theory that we're trying to unify, the phenomena, are not just different from one another, but vastly different from one another, then it seems that there can be no theory for them, no unity. And then Owen responds to this, and he says, well, but maybe this is just too severe of a requirement to say that we need unity, right? We can't say that we can't have a theory if we can't have a unified theory, because a unified theory is stronger than a theory. If we can't have a theory, then we can't have a unified theory. But to just show that we can't have a unified theory is not to show that we can't have a theory. And maybe it's just too strong of a requirement that we have a unified theory. So the issue is not that we cannot unify a hodgepodge, but the question is whether we could have any theory of a hodgepodge. And we can, he says, because if you look, this is the nature of physics and chemistry. Physics and chemistry bring together different things, but they are themselves not unified. There is no unified theory of physics. Physics has different areas. Those areas are well worked out. They unify a group of phenomena based on coherent properties among those phenomena, but that corner of physics over there and this corner of physics over here, we cannot bring them together consistently. There's something like a family relationship among them, but we can't unify them. The quest for the theory of everything, that's the quest for unified physics. It's a very big research program. Many people think we need to unify physics. After all, if we're going to reduce our theories, we have to have a single theory to reduce everything to. And we could have a single theory of the world. And in the background of all the ontology talk we've been making is sort of an idealism that thinks, well, to say that there is materialism or to say that there is physicalism or naturalism is to say that we do have, at least ideally at some future time, a theory of science, a single base theory of science that can unify everything. If reductionism is possible, we can unify everything to a given science, and the ontology of the world is defined by that single science. This is a goal for science. It is not the current state of science. It's a goal of physics to unify physics, but physics is not now unified. Nonetheless, that does not mean that physics is not a theory or physics is not a group of related, similar theories. They are, they're just not fully unified. So maybe we could give a theory of consciousness without it being fully unified. But when I said that Mcginn is operating on this assumption that consciousness is a monolithic thing, he was thinking of consciousness either as a single property or as a group of properties that are unified. But maybe they're not. Maybe they're very different, and we need to figure out the differences as much as the similarities, and therefore we account for consciousness by a bunch of different non-identical theories. And so the mere fact that there are different properties does not mean we can't have a theory of mind. The mere fact that there's a hodgepodge of different properties does not mean we cannot have a theory of mind. Maybe it means we cannot have a unified theory of mind. Maybe it doesn't. We don't know for sure on that. But to say there's a hodgepodge would be at most to challenge that there could be a unified theory, not that there could be a theory. And so the three things he grants about consciousness do not get in the way of giving a theory. So now we've talked about the possibility of giving a natural theory of consciousness, a natural theory of mind, even a unified theory of mind. But now we need to talk about, okay, so one, we've said it's possible, but then how do we go about doing it? He says we go about doing it by way of the natural method. And first, I should say about Owen is that it's a great impertinent arrogance to call his own method the natural method. His method is not the natural method. At most, it's a natural method or something of this sort. He called it the natural method. I think if anything, it's the natural method of investigating consciousness empirically. Maybe that would be a fine name for it, but to call it just the natural method, that's an arrogance and a falsity. So nonetheless, the natural method, which is this, or roughly this, we have our various sciences that are concerned with consciousness. And he says, well, this is how he presented in his book, the book that he has about dreams. He presents the natural method. And actually, he did not say in the book, but he says in the article briefly that the natural method would include all of the sciences that have anything to do with consciousness, including, say, literature. Right? So literature would be taken here as part of this circle. All of the sciences working together, but certainly this main three sciences working together. We use them in an interacting method to produce a theory of consciousness. And so our big theories here, we have neuroscience, we have psychology, cognitive science, folk psychology, all together there, and phenomenology. And why do we group these things this way? Well, because they are ontologically different in the way they talk. The theories are different. Folk psychology and psychology are concerned with the same things. They have a different methodology to study the same thing. They're both concerned with, say, beliefs and desires. So is cognitive science. Neuroscience, not concerned with beliefs and desires, concerned with neurons, cells in the brain, electricity, chemicals. Phenomenology is concerned with qualia. We can combine these three such that phenomenology informs neuroscience and informs psychology, cognitive science, folk psychology, and all of them inform each other about what they know about consciousness. By that method, we can go about giving a theory of consciousness. So notice that Mcginn said our situation was Necker cube. Either we look from the level of phenomenology or we look from the level of neuroscience. One or the other, and from that we can never figure out property P. Well, here, property P is the explanation of a relationship between two things of a different sort. So the way to go about doing that is to look at various sciences that are concerned with different sorts of things. And he says that the natural method gives us evidence to suggest that there is a coherence to consciousness. And what we're seeking here, we're seeking a report from psychology, a report from neuroscience, a report from phenomenology, any of the other sciences that are relevant, behavioral economics, etc. We want reports from these things. We get lots of statements. We throw them up in the air, and we want to gain a reflective equilibrium. So we think about it. We want to come to a way to hold all of these statements true at once. If we can't hold all of them true at once, we find the one that's offending and get rid of it. And so we're going to have lots and lots of sentences here, so this is going to be very complicated. Lots and lots of evidence coming in from all of these sciences. They're all doing studies upon studies, lots of evidence. We want to get all this evidence to be coherent. How can all of these claims be true at once? If they can't be, if we've looked, we've tried, then either we can add other beliefs to them, other claims to them, to get a reflective equilibrium, or take some away. Maybe reflective equilibrium is best understood by what happens when we don't have reflective equilibrium. We have something like a cognitive dissonance. So if I give you a much smaller set of beliefs, say 1, believe that the mind is immaterial and extended. 2, believe the body is extended material. 3, believe the mind and body interact. We cannot bring those 3 by themselves into reflective equilibrium. It's what we've been seeking to do all along. One way to do it, we can add in another belief. Well, they interact at the pineal gland. Doesn't work. We didn't get coherence from that. There was still a dissonance. We want to oscillate between one front and the other front in our Necker cube. There's a dissonance there. So what we can do is we can take away one of the beliefs. Well, let's take away the belief that the mental is existent at all, or that it is immaterial. Let's believe that the mental is just another way to talk about the physical. Take away a belief, add in another belief, now see if we have reflective equilibrium. This is what we're seeking. We're seeking a coherence among the properties. We're seeking reflective equilibrium amongst the beliefs, the reports, the evidence from these various sciences. And so he says, look, there's good evidence using the natural method that there is a coherence, that we can gain reflective equilibrium. How do we do this? Or how can we get evidence of this? He says, well, look at the case of dreams. There's a debate within dreams. People talk about dreams from different standpoints, and there's a debate. Are we conscious when we dream? Maybe from folk psychology, the report is yes. I experienced my dream when I was asleep. But then there were other theories that said, well, no, look, one grounds for this was verificationist. This was the sort of antiquated science that Chalmers was using. But a verificationist says, well, look, the only things that count as evidence are things we can see. I can't see you have a dream. I don't even see myself have a dream. Rather, when I wake up, I can see myself report that I had a dream. I can see you report that you had a dream. So what dreams are just dream reports. That's what exists. So we're not conscious when we dream. Rather, the word dream refers to a dream report. We're conscious during the dream report, but there is nothing that was a conscious state while we were asleep. When we wake up, something happens in our brain that makes us say, when I was asleep, I had a conscious experience, but I didn't. Debate among dreams. Are we conscious when we dream? Is there such a thing as consciousness during sleep? Now notice the verificationists is eliminativists. They get rid of, from the ontology, this state you could be in where you are both asleep and conscious. And so we have different claims. We have one coming from a certain group of scientists, verificationists, antiquated though they be, and another claim that's inconsistent with it, that we are conscious when we sleep, from, say, our folk experience. We have contradicting claims here. They can't both be true, and so we can't have a reflective equilibrium among a group of statements that include these both. We have to do something. One of these has to go, or we have to add something in to explain how they could both be true. And so, well, there's a finding. Right? He brings these as, well, look, good evidence recently from neuroscience, that is recent to 15 years ago, that when we have subjective awareness, awareness of ourselves, this being at least a kind of consciousness, qualitative and all, there is a certain kind of brain activity, 40 hertz oscillations. This can occur in different places. Kind of brain activity. 40 hertz oscillation. Subjective awareness, that is a qualitative mental phenomenological property, is associated with 40 hertz oscillations. This is the finding. Neuroscience, we have a property, the property of 40 hertz oscillations. From phenomenology, we have subjective awareness, this being a type of property, right? This also being a type of property because we can have 40 hertz oscillations in all different kinds of all different places in our brain. So a type property, subjective awareness, a type property, 40 hertz oscillation. Finding in neuroscience, when people report phenomenologically to have subjective awareness, we can see from neuroscience that neurologically they're experiencing, that is, their brain is undergoing 40 hertz oscillation. So now we have a question. Well, look, from psychology, we have an idea that there are dreams that are made up of REM. Right? So the concept REM, dreams come from folk psychology. We have dreams. We find out from psychology that there is REM, rapid eye movement state that we're in. We think from psychology that we have rapid eye movement when we are having dreams. So then the question, we had a problem, two inconsistent beliefs that were preventing reflective equilibrium about consciousness and dreams. We can solve that problem, it seems. REM, when dreams are supposed to happen. Consciousness, subjective awareness occurs when we have 40 hertz oscillation. So, do we have 40 hertz oscillation when we are in REM? Someone's in REM, you wake them up, they are able to report that they were currently having a dream. When people are in that state, will we find that they're in 40 hertz oscillation? And the answer is yes, we do find that they're having 40 hertz oscillation. And so by combining these three sciences, a finding of 40 hertz oscillation, a finding subjective awareness, a finding REM. Now look, the finding of 40 hertz oscillation of subjective awareness, it may seem that this is a natural sort of neuroscientific move, but this is not pure neuroscience. Because neuroscience cannot observe subjective awareness. They have to ask the participants to report based on phenomenology, their qualitative experience, whether they're having subjective awareness. And then from that, they pinpoint what's going on neuroscientifically at that point. Neuroscience by itself would only look at neurons and interactions between the neurons within, their axons, their dendrites, their firings, etc. So that is the ontology of neuroscience by itself. So we've combined three sciences here, and we found that, well, look, it does look like we can answer this problem. Yes, there is consciousness, that is subjective awareness, in REM while we have dreams. So we've responded to the eliminativist, the verificationist. We get rid of this belief that there are no such things as dreams, there's no such thing as a conscious state while asleep. We've gotten closer to reflective equilibrium. And there's a nice quote there from the scientists who ran the study that said, it's the dialogue between the thalamus and the cortex that generates subjectivity. And no one then says, science. But this is an important sort of quote he uses. He may not bring out why it's important. He says, science, wonderful science. Yes, wonderful science, but why is this so important? Well, one, if we go back to the objection we saw last week to the argument for epiphenomenalism, one of the arguments was that, well, we can't account for the subjective by way of a general science. Subjective experiences are unique to given subjects. But science by its nature is general, and so we can't have a general science of the subjective. But here, my personal qualitative experience is subjective. Nonetheless, I just answered a question about it by way of general sciences. My subjective experience comes in through my phenomenology. I can tell you when I'm having subjective awareness, and as a matter of general fact, when I do, I'm experiencing 40 hertz oscillation. When you express this, you're also. Now this is very far from giving a general account of my specific qualitative experience with the redness of my red and so on. But we don't want to make the Mcginn problem and mistake a paucity, a small amount of progress for no progress. We may be really far from giving a full general account of my subjective experience, but we have answered some question about my subjective experience with general science. So the fact that science can tell us that subjectivity is generated when the thalamus and the cortex communicate, that's a big deal. That is a counter to the epiphenomenalist claim from last week. But also it's a counter to Mcginn's claim that science gives us no idea about how we can have consciousness, no idea about property P. Now again, the monolithic view that there is one thing that is consciousness goes along with this view that there's one monolithic property P, but maybe there are many property P, property P1, property P2, property P3. These are the way different subjective experiences interact with different physical realizations. So what does this all tell us? Well, this tells us that it seems science can make progress here. There can be a progressive research program. And one thing it does, once we do this, how do we see that there's a progressive research program? Well, we had a problem. We were facing a problem. We solved that problem with the natural method, appealing to different sciences. looking at their different theoretical ontological claims, using their specific methods to generate those, and then using those various findings together, adjudicating between disagreements, we found a solution to a problem. But when we find a solution to that problem, when we say, look, there is something similar between being awake and saying you're conscious and being asleep and saying you're conscious, that is having a dream, something similar between those two states, 40 hertz oscillation in both cases. But then why is it that when I dream and I am running, I don't move? But when I'm awake and I'm conscious of running, I am moving. There's a difference between dream consciousness and awake consciousness. And so we get a progressive research program because we solve one problem and we find another. This is how science progresses. So now we need to figure out this problem. And how do we figure out this problem? Well, as a matter of fact, there's a part of our brain responsible for input-output gating that sort of turns off our senses when we're in REM. And so the 40 hertz oscillations we have while asleep occur during REM, and at the same time, input-output gating occurs to turn off our motor activity, our postural muscles, certain of our senses. So the one similarity between dream consciousness, awake consciousness, 40 hertz oscillation. The difference between dream consciousness and awake consciousness, during dream consciousness, input-output gating is turned on. During awake consciousness, it is not. So, natural method has now explained that yes, there is consciousness while dreaming. There's something similar between a dream state and a conscious state. And we've also explained the difference between the two. This is good science. We're making progress here. So therefore, the natural method, what does it say here? Oh. So using phenomenology, neuroscience, psychology, we've made progress. We've got to reflective equilibrium amongst their reports. We've got to something coherent, some similarity between the properties of REM, consciousness, dreaming there, and awake consciousness. There's a coherence among them. They share 40 hertz oscillation. There's also something different about them. There you go. Two heterogeneous properties, two properties that are not the same. They share different things. Two events that share different properties, have properties they do not share. They're heterogeneous. We've unified them by way of a coherence, finding where they overlap. And so in this progress, using the natural method, we're going to get reports from one place, reports from another place, reports from another place. We have lots of sentences, lots of beliefs, reports that we want to bring into coherence, reflective equilibrium. If we don't have reflective equilibrium, one thing we can do is seek more information to try and explain how the sentences we have could all be true at once, or we can take one out. When we take one out, we're taking a sentence out that was originated by one of these sciences. All of these sciences are on equal footing. Any of their reports could be held false, could be rejected. Maybe it's folk psychology that ends up having to give something up if we have an inconsistency. Maybe it's neuroscience, maybe it's phenomenology, maybe it's literature, maybe so on, so on, so on. Any of these could be held wrong if we get a conflict, and we need to remove a belief to seek reflective equilibrium. Any of these sciences could be held to be the faulty science. And so how would this occur with, well, so what occurred in the dream case? Well, in the dream case, psychology was telling us that there is a similarity between dreams and awaking. Phenomenology was telling that there is a similarity between dreams and waking. Neuroscience was not there yet. Or maybe psychology was the one, well, the verifications were in psychology, so it was phenomenology that was telling us a similarity between dreams and being awake. Psychology had to give something up, particularly had to give away this verificationist, behaviorist, right? The verificationists in psychology are behaviorists. I can't observe you dreaming. I can't observe your mind. What I can observe is you reporting dreams when you wake up. So the behaviorist psychology was giving us this claim that there are no such things as dreams, there are only dreams reports. And based on phenomenology and neuroscience, we forced so as to have a consistent reflective equilibrium we forced psychology, the verificationist aspect of psychology, the behaviorists, to give up their claim that there's no such thing as dreams. Really, behaviorist? Because our experience says otherwise, and so does neuroscience. The weight of two sciences versus this one methodological commitment of behaviorism, you've got to give that up. Now it's curious, something comes out here. I'm going to say this relationship between verificationism and verificationism in psychology. Behaviorism takes the methodological commitment of verificationism from somewhere higher. So I want to say that here. Bring back to that in a minute. How else might this reflective equilibrium, forcing one science to give something up? Could we ever be forced to modify our phenomenological account of consciousness? Throughout, there has been this very strong claim that, well, look, we're experts on our own consciousness. We experience it directly. And so that's one reason the mind-body problem is such a big problem, is because the thing that we've been at times getting rid of in our ontology is the thing we're most certain of. If we go back to Descartes, the one thing Descartes could start being certain of was that he was a thinking thing. He exists as a mental thing. But then the one thing we're giving up when we're forced to seek reflective equilibrium is the mental. Seems very strange. Why would we give up the thing that we're most certain of? How could we ever be forced to modify our account of what counts as conscious? Could we ever be conscious and not know it? Think about that for a second. Could you ever be conscious and not know it? Could you ever be not conscious and know it? It seems that the word conscious is so closely tied to things like knowledge, experience. Could you ever be not conscious and experience it? Could you ever be conscious and not experience it? It seems like those are too tight for us to ever say, yes, we could be conscious and not experience it. We could be unconscious and experience it. Doesn't seem possible. But if we progress this research program and we find lots and lots and lots of things out in neuroscience, in psychology, and so forth about consciousness, and the qualitative things start to look just like a group of properties that share some things in common with all of these other properties being reported to us from psychology, neuroscience, etc. Maybe we want to say that there are times that we're conscious, but we don't know that we're conscious. This seems very strange, but there are cases of like blind sight. There are people who report having no experience, no visual experience. This is a thing, it generally comes with a brain injury of some sort. But you can divide a person's sight, and on one eye, they do not report seeing anything. But you can present something to them and then ask them, using the other eye, which they do report experience with, to choose between a group of options. And they choose the option that matches the thing that they report they cannot see, with a degree of statistical significance, a severe degree of statistical significance. That is, they get right this thing that they report not being conscious of. Now, what do we say in that case? Are you conscious of it or are you not conscious of it? And go back to Charles Sanders Peirce. He had this machine where he could test discrimination ability between various shades of a given color. There's this doctrine coming from the German schools. We're talking foundation of psychology here, 170 years ago. The findings from psychology in Germany, Wundt and these people, that there are these universal facts about the doctrine of just noticeable differences. And that is, if I give you an input sensation, I can increase that input sensation to some percentage without you noticing it. And that defines, at the point I get to the place where you can notice it, that is the just noticeable difference. And for any amplitude of input, I can increase that amplitude of input by some degree without you noticing it. It falls below your conscious awareness. And so if I have you hold out your hand and put a weight in your hand, I can then increase that weight by some small percent of that weight without you knowing it. At some point, I increase it by the just noticeable difference, and then you'll say, hey, you just increased the weight. And for all our sense inputs, we have this fact that there is some threshold past which we notice there's been a change and before which we do not notice there's been a change. Well, Peirce had this machine for psychological testing that he spent a great deal of money creating, and he carried it around with him, and he tested people who were expert observers. And he would give them one shade of a color on one eye, one shade of a color on the other, and ask them, can you tell any difference? And they would say, no, I cannot tell any difference. And then he would say, nonetheless, I need you to tell me which of the two is, say, brighter, lighter. And they would report, because they were forced to report. But they got it right with a statistically significant degree of accuracy. They got the question right, even though consciously they said they could not experience a difference between the colors. So if consciousness is determined by not just qualitative experience, but getting information from the environment and being able to use that information, is that consciousness or not? I don't know. But we could end up getting enough weight on those facts that the blindside individuals, that this doctrine of just noticeable difference. So notice what Peirce was doing there, was challenging this doctrine of just noticeable difference. Even though people do not report noticing the difference, they do notice the difference because they can get questions based on the difference right. So they do notice it, they just don't notice it that they notice it. And so maybe eventually we get forced into saying, revising our common sense, phenomenological, folk psychological account of consciousness to say there are times in which we're conscious despite the fact that we don't have experiences. Or that we're not conscious of something even though we're experiencing it. Maybe we get forced into that direction. Any of these sciences, no matter how well established they seem, are open for revision based on the natural method. And so from this, we conclude, well, look, it seems like there's evidence that the natural method could be used to develop a theory of mind. We've already done it for parts of a theory of consciousness, the theory of one part of the theory of consciousness during dreaming. That's progress. Maybe it's not lots of progress. Maybe Mcginn still says not much progress, no reason to think we're going to complete the theory of the mind. But part of the issue there is that what he's seeming to be saying is that there is a unified, monolithic property consciousness that's explained as a part of explaining mind by explaining property P, a single property about the relationship between mind and body. But we see in the dream case that we explained the relationship between the body and the mind while conscious and asleep by appealing to what? 40 Hertz isolation and input-output gating. But the relationship between the mental property, consciousness, and awake, we explained just by appeal to 40 Hertz, or by appeal to 40 Hertz oscillation and no input-output gating. So if the property P is what explains the relationship between the mental property of subjective awareness or consciousness and the bodily thing that's occurring, well, in one case, P was 40 Hertz oscillation and input-output gating. In another case, it was 40 Hertz oscillation and not input-output gating. And so unless we want to make P a disjunctive property, we have two different P's there. If we have two different P's there, maybe we have two different aspects of consciousness. And so consciousness is not a monolithic thing. If we make it a non-monolithic thing, maybe it seems like an easier problem. Maybe he takes consciousness to be causally close to us because it's a very big, complicated thing. If we break it into its parts, even if we don't see all of its parts, if we can work hard to find some of its parts, then maybe each of those things individually is not cognitively close to us. If it's not, then at least potentially we can move in the direction of a theory of C itself, consciousness itself. Maybe we never get there. Owen closes his chapter by saying, look, there's two ways that we could develop a science of the mind, a science of consciousness, as a part of a science of mind. One is that we end up with a unified science so that we get all of these sciences reporting to us. We end up with a list of beliefs about what is true about the mind. And these things are nice and neat enough. They're different, but they're not hodgepodge. And so we can develop laws on these properties, the relationship between these properties, and all of these laws occur in a single theoretical language, and that would be the language of the science of the mind. Maybe when we do that, some of these other sciences fall away, or maybe they're still interested. Maybe these end up being the sciences of studies of various parts of the mind, or the body and the mind. But if we could get from these a set of beliefs, various sets of beliefs, and unify them in a single language, then we have a unified theory of mind. That's one way to deliver a science of the mind. Another way to do it is to give a non-unified account, where we have various properties, say occurring in neuroscience, that explain some parts of consciousness, other properties, say occurring in phenomenology, explaining other parts of consciousness, and we have laws among those properties in phenomenology, we have laws among those properties in neuroscience, but we cannot come up with a way to bring those together. They're too different. Nonetheless, what we've done is sort of break the mind up into parts, and we can explain all of it, but we do it through different theories. And so we have a non-unified theory of mind that ends up explaining everything we want to explain, but just by breaking it up into different parts. And maybe then we see the world very differently. And so we've eliminated this idea that there is a unified thing that is consciousness that could be studied by a single unified science. No, we've seen that it's a vastly different, it's a group of vastly different sorts of things. And so we end up studying it by different approaches, different sciences. And so we end up here, we started sitting down by the fire and considering the nature of mind by thinking really hard. And then we progressed through what I've said throughout is the method of science to adjudicate disputes, find solutions to problems with various theories in a scientific nature. And we've ended up in a place where our last reading is from Owen Flanagan, and he says, science, we study the mind through the natural method, and the natural method appeals to specific sciences. So then the question is, well, why philosophy of mind at all as opposed to, say, psychology or neurology? Why, if the conclusion to the entire semester is that we ought look at psychology, or we ought look at neuroscience, or we ought develop a more precise science of phenomenology, why did we not just start on day one saying that we want to give an account of the mind and we're going to look at science to do that, as opposed to look at the scientific development of theories of mind? Why didn't we just start with psychology on day one? Well, the answer is that within naturalism, we get a conception of philosophy as scientific. But the kind of science that philosophy does, or is kinescopic. Kinescopy uses the method of science, not the scientific method, the method of science, which is an epistemic method for arriving at and adjudicating between beliefs and disputes. Kinescopy uses the epistemic method of science on the most general of problems. And kinescopy, or philosophy, naturalized philosophy, is different than idioscopy, which are those sciences that look at specific problems by way of specific observation methods. Phenomenology looks at specific problems. It's not concerned with, say, the weight of objects at all. It might be concerned with how heavy something feels to you, but it is not concerned with mass, because that's not a phenomenological property, and its methods are observation, internal subjective experience. Neuroscience uses CAT scans, fMRIs, cutting open brains, and is concerned with neurons. Its own set of problems, its own set of methods, and so forth. Some sciences use microscopes, others use telescopes. They have their own methods of observation. If a science has its own method of observation and its own specific set of problems, it's idioscopic. Philosophy, naturalized philosophy, is scientific because it shares the same methodological commitments as the specific sciences. Each of the specific idioscopic sciences has its own specific methodological commitments because of its own specific problem and its own specific means of observing things. But all of the idioscopic sciences share the most general methodological tenets of kinoscopy. And kinoscopy is science in its most general, concerned with the nature of truth, how to go about realizing that truth, the methods to be used to inquire into anything and what follows from that. And so why we don't conclude the semester by saying go do psychology to develop a theory of the mind, or go do neuroscience to develop a theory of the mind, you can't do that because there are two options to develop a theory of mind. Either we have a unified theory by pulling from all of the various sciences we're using in the natural method, or we have a non-unified theory. But by definition, all of the scientists working in these various sciences are only experts in their field. And so the phenomenologist can only tell me about the phenomenological parts of consciousness. The neuroscientist can only tell me about the neurological parts of consciousness. And if we look at dreams, what we did was we account for subjective experience by way of 40 Hertz oscillations. And then we accounted for dreams, REM, by connecting it to the phenomenological property of subjective awareness and two things from neuroscience: input-output gating and 40 Hertz oscillations. We have 1, 2, 3, or even 4 arrows here. These arrows are relationships between various properties in the various sciences. The neurologist can tell me about 40 Hertz oscillation. The neurologist can tell me about input-output gating. The neurologist cannot tell me about the subjective awareness of the person who's having that 40 Hertz oscillation. That involves a connection between a report from phenomenology and a report from neuroscience. The neuroscientist is not an expert here, and so the neuroscientist finds herself in the problem that Mcginn says, for the neurologist, this phenomenological property is cognitively off limits, cognitively closed. Because the neuroscientist is an idioscopist dwelling in its own world with its own problems and own methods of observation. Those methods of observation do not allow observation of this. Moreover, the phenomenological methods of observation do not allow for observation of 40 Hertz oscillation. But neither of these methods allow for observation of the connection between them. We need kinoscopy, which is the scientific methodology that looks at things with the most general of observation methods, the problems that affect all of the sciences. And one of the problems that connects all of the sciences is the relationship between those sciences. And if you think last week about what we looked at with Churchlism was concerned with giving us an account of reductionism, a reduction of one science to another science. And so that is concerned with giving the nature of this arrow, and this arrow, and this arrow. The nature of this arrow is cognitively closed to the neurologist, to the phenomenologist, to the psychologist, to the folk psychologist. They cannot report on the nature of this arrow. Who can report on the nature of this arrow? The kinoscopist can. Who's the kinoscopist? The naturalized philosopher. A theory of mind will occur if one of two things happens. Either we can explain all of these arrows and come up with a nice unified theory, or we can't explain some of these arrows, and therefore we have some reports of consciousness coming from here, and some reports of consciousness coming from here, and consciousness ends up to be a non-unified, nonetheless theoretic thing. We have various sciences that can tell us, but whether we arrive at a unified or a non-unified theory, that's to be told us by evaluating whether or not we can give these arrows, these bridge laws, these reductions, and if we can, unified theory, if we can't, non-unified theory. But who can tell us that? The kinoscopist, the philosopher, the naturalized philosopher. And so, we cannot get a theory of mind from the sciences. The scientists are idioscopists. We have to have the kinoscopist to give us a theory of mind, to evaluate whether these have these arrows, what the relationship between is from phenomenology and neuroscience. And now you could say here, well, but yeah, this is an arrogance for philosophers because you could just have a neuroscientist learn phenomenology and learn psychology and learn about bridge laws and reduction. That's fine, but once you've done that, you've become a kinoscopist. That is, you're now doing philosophy because neuroscientist has to do something additional beyond her training in neuroscience. Mary cannot explain the relationship between a qualitative experience and a neurological event, even though Mary knows everything about a neurological event. There's a response from philosophy of science to Jackson, right there. Mary's a neuroscientist. She's an idioscopist. Explaining what she experienced is not an idioscopic issue. It is a kinescopic issue. So one, there, that's why we need a philosophy of science. We can't just do science and develop a theory of mind. It has to come through philosophy. But one additional thing I want to say here in response to Mcginn. When we're doing kinoscopy, that is naturalized philosophy, the method of science, one thing it tells us when we're looking at investigation, truth, how to learn about what is true, the methods to properly inquire into anything, to develop theories. One thing we learned very early on in our methodology is that if we want to know about anything, say consciousness, one thing we cannot do is assume that we cannot know about that thing. That would be inconsistent with our very goals. So if we say we cannot know the nature of consciousness, we guarantee that we cannot know the nature of consciousness because we then cannot inquire into it. If there's any possibility that we know about the nature of consciousness, if we do gain knowledge of property P, if we ever do gain a theory of mind, it's required that we believe we can know property P, we can have a theory of mind. And so this goes back to my issue with Mcginn, and this goes back to my issue with Chalmers. They both claimed that it would be an arrogance to think that we could understand everything. The only grounds for thinking that we could understand everything, or the only grounds for thinking we can have a theory of mind and understanding of property P, would be an arrogant metaphysical commitment to materialism. Foster, I guess, said this too. But it's not the only grounds. There are good, scientific, naturalized grounds for saying, even though, if we grant what they want to claim, that we have no empirical evidence that we could ever gain a theoretical, scientific account of mind, even though we have no evidence, we're still warranted in believing we can have knowledge of mind. Why? Because we want to learn. We can't learn if we assume that we can't learn. So one way we can undermine ourselves is by assuming that we can never know something. And so a methodological rule of naturalism is that we never assume that we can't know something. And that is on purely epistemic methodological grounds. No arrogance, no metaphysics. It follows from the very kinescopic nature of inquiry, our desire to learn, that we cannot assume that we cannot learn. And so this comes from Peirce. This is all an account of naturalism built on Peirce. And one thing he notes here is if you look, if we want to pessimistic meta-induction, also what we can do is run an optimistic meta-induction and see that there are lots and lots and lots of times when people have said, we will never know, and then we end up finding out. And his favorite example was Auguste Comte, who said, one thing, science will do lots of things, but one thing we will never know is the chemical composition of stars. But almost immediately after Comte said this, a very accomplished philosopher and scientist said this, the spectroscope was invented, and we determined the chemical composition of stars. And so this is a great historical example where someone said, we can never know. And if everyone were to buy into Comte, people would have said, oh crap, we've been working on the spectroscope, but Comte said we'll never know, so let's stop working on it because we believe we'll never know. That would block the road to progress, to developing a theory, a progressive research program to develop a theory that is coherent, that brings together all of our various properties, all of our various reports, evidence, phenomena, into a given account, a unified account. If we buy Mcginn's claim, if we buy Foster and Chalmers' claim, we've blocked the road to inquiring into consciousness, into a solution to the mind-body problem. There are good methodological grounds for doing that. Even if we have no evidence that we could ever solve the mind-body problem, we do not need evidence to nonetheless believe that there is a solution and we can know that solution and that be consistent with good naturalized scientific philosophy. And so we've gotten to a point where we've described what it would mean to account for the mind-body problem. We have not solved the mind-body problem, but we've described in more and more detail what the mind-body problem is, what it would mean to give an account of mind. And now we see a debate. Can we ever get a theory of mind? Mcginn says no. But if we give up the pursuit for a theory of mind, we give up the pursuit or the need to come up with a solution to the mind-body problem. No theory of mind that we can ever access, but no mind-body problem. Flanagan says there is a mind-body problem. Lots of questions about how consciousness occurs, about how mind and body interact. It's a hard problem. It's going to require lots of our various sciences in order to answer. But we can make progress on that problem. We've shown that. And so the prospects for a theory of mind are still open. You're sort of left to choose there between the prospect of having a theory of mind and facing a real problem, and having no theory of mind possible to us, but there being no real problem. And we've done that within naturalism without going back to dualism or anything spooky. For my part, all of the weight here, as far as if I'm forced to choose between McGinn's position and Flanagan's position, I choose Flanagan's position because I think that even if we're wrong that there could be a theory of mind, if there's any chance that we get a theory of mind, we must say that we could have a theory of mind. Flanagan could be wrong. Maybe he works really hard, he influences people to work really hard, and there is no theory of mind. Maybe that's lots of wasted effort that could be put somewhere else. Mcginn, if McGinn's wrong, we could have a theory of mind and we never get it because we don't try. And for my part, I would rather try for something that we cannot have but potentially could than to give up something that we could have if we tried. Now, the weight against Mcginn, the cost there is that there could be a theory of mind, but we've given it up, and so we never realize a theory of mind. That seems to be a very large cost. The cost on Flanagan is either lots of wasted effort because we don't have a way to get a theory of mind, but he's sketched a method by which to get a theory of mind. We're not just grasping in the dark here. We're not just doing Cartesian metaphysics. We have a method. The natural method, that is, the natural method of investigating consciousness. And that is by appealing to the various sciences, finding out how they relate, get all of their reports, seek reflective equilibrium, adjudicate disputes, add beliefs, take away beliefs until we get something consistent either locally in various areas and we have a non-unified account, or globally all of the reports come together consistently. This is just how things happen in other sciences like physics, like chemistry. We can do it with mind also. And if we can do that, we have a method for solving the mind-body problem, explaining consciousness, for delivering a theory of mind. And so, prospects aren't that bad. So the cost of Flanagan is that we have the problem to be solved. But that cost may not be that concerning because he gives us a sketch of the method of doing such. He's even shown that progress has been made. And so, go do scientific work, go do psychology, neurology, and do a part in solving the problem of mind. But the problem of mind itself will have to be explained philosophically, kinescopically, at least until the point that we have a science of mind. And then, the nature of the mental, the nature of possibly mind-body interaction, is the subject matter of that philosophy, that science of mind. Until we reach that point, and even if we do reach that point, if there is a science of the body and a science of the mind, then the issue of a philosophy of mind is a philosophical issue, kinescopic philosophical issue. So we don't get an answer to the question. We get an answer about where we stand on answering the question. Be a dualist, admit that there is no solution to the problem. Be a non-constructive naturalist, say that there is no problem to be solved, but we can never understand mind. Or be a constructive naturalist and say there is a problem. We solve that problem with science, and we will develop a theory of mind. Theory of mind not based on science and real problem. No problem, but science and no theory of mind. Or still a problem that we're working on, have a method for it, and eventually a theory of mind. Those are your three choices, looking from the top down, and you can put in place various theories in each of those approaches and see how their different claims shape out and see which beliefs we want to hold and seek amongst our various experiences a reflective equilibrium. Okay, and that's the semester. I hope you send any questions you have to me. Still have lots of work to be done on your draft and on your final paper. Hopefully this gets you thinking about the nature of mind in a different way, about your mind in a different way, and hopefully about sciences in a different way. It's been fun.